Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of those stories where the edges blur between crime and curiosity, where even the so-called bad guy seems more interested in a crossword puzzle than your wallet. Imagine that. You expect danger, alarms, maybe a shadow slipping out the back door, but instead you find pencil smudges on a coffee table and a crossword grid left half complete. That's the kind of tale we're unraveling tonight. The puzzle-loving burglar who turned break-ins into bedtime riddles. And fair warning, you might not make it out of this one without suddenly wanting to buy one of those pocket puzzle books for yourself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this little bedtime circle of ours stretches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk down a narrow street in a small town that doesn't even pretend to be glamorous. The kind of place where shop windows look like they haven't changed in years. Where the smell of rain-soaked bricks lingers long after the clouds are gone. There's comfort here, but also monotony. And maybe that monotony is why some restless, clever someone, decided to stir things up. Not with smashed locks or smashed faces, but with puzzles. The first time it happened, people barely noticed. A widow came home from church to find her back door ajar, her silver spoons missing. And this is the part that made her blink twice. Her crossword book pulled from the shelf and opened to page 37. A grid was half-filled, neat handwriting pressing into the cheap paper, clues answered in pencil. Whoever had been in her home had stopped mid-thought, leaving 5 across unfinished. That detail bothered her more than the spoons. At least spoons can be replaced. A stranger's thoughts scratching across her puzzle? That stayed. You imagine yourself standing in her kitchen. The air still holds the ghost of her tea, now cold in a chipped mug on the counter. You pick up the puzzle book, your thumb brushing the indentation where a pencil pressed too hard on the word orbit. You glance at the window, wide open as though the burglar had stepped out for a breath of fresh air rather than a getaway. No violence, no chaos, just absence, and the eerie presence of someone else's mind, halfway through a crossword. Psychologists might call this a ritual. A ritual isn't always candles and chants. It can be the small, repeated thing that calms the chaos inside. And maybe that's what these puzzles were. You can picture him. Yes, you assume it's a him because most of the case notes lean that way. Sitting in the quiet, hunched over the puzzle, one hand reaching absent-mindedly into a stranger's cookie tin, while the other scribbles an answer. Control through letters. Safety through patterns. The world outside unpredictable, but 7 down is always just a clue away. You'd think the police would pounce on such a detail. A crossword left behind? Surely a fingerprint smudge? A DNA strand caught on the page? But no. The burglar seemed to know exactly how much pressure to use with the pencil, how lightly to flip the pages. The pages themselves were torn out sometimes, left folded on the floor, as if even the burglar wanted no loose ends. So instead of a trail of evidence, investigators were left with a trail of riddles. Imagine sitting in a police station, staring at a crossword that reads key EST for largest desert. Was he testing them, mocking them, or simply bored and distracted? Here's a quirky fact to lull you deeper. Crosswords were once considered dangerous to public productivity. In the 1920s, newspapers worried that people were wasting too much time filling in grids instead of working. Libraries even banned puzzle books, calling them a plague. So maybe our burglar was just carrying on a long tradition of crossword rebellion. Except instead of skipping office work, he skipped legality altogether. As you stroll mentally through this little town, you notice how word spread. First, it was just a widow telling her neighbor. Then the barber joked about it while trimming hair. Don't forget to lock up, or he'll finish your Sudoku too. And slowly, the whole town carried this hush of unease. Break-ins, yes, but ones with manners. Houses weren't trashed, pets weren't harmed. It was as though the burglar tiptoed in, took a few valuables, and then got distracted by a crossword like a kid sneaking cookies before dinner. Yet, isn't that almost worse? A chaotic ransack you can process. Some brute stormed in, grabbed what he wanted, left. But this was intimacy. Someone sat in your chair, breathed your air, and thought their quiet thoughts while their pencil tapped on your table. The violation wasn't in the missing spoon. It was in the half-complete word orbit. That's what made residents keep the lights on longer at night. Here's where the mirror effect creeps in. You think of yourself, the times you've sat bored at a kitchen table, doodling half-formed words, procrastinating on something important by chasing the answer to 3 down. Haven't you left your own puzzles unfinished, scattered on desks, or folded into bags? And suddenly the burglar doesn't feel like a monster. He feels uncomfortably familiar, just a human, restless and craving order in tiny black and white squares. Of course, experts still argue whether this was strategy or accident. Was the burglar intentionally planting crosswords as a taunt? Or were they simply so absorbed that they couldn't help themselves? Some criminologists point to narcissism, the desire to leave a signature to say, "I was here," without spray paint or graffiti. Others insist it was a coping mechanism, his nervous system calming down after the adrenaline spike of breaking in. And a third camp? They shrug. Maybe he just liked puzzles and got carried away. Not everything has to be profound. You pause, letting the thought hang. Not everything has to be profound. But sometimes the simplest details, the graphite smudge, the faint eraser dust glowing in lamplight, end up being the very things that haunt. You move with the detectives now, shuffling through the stacks of case notes, the kind where the coffee stains on the folders are darker than the ink. They look tired. The burglaries aren't frequent, one every few weeks maybe. But they're steady enough to create this feeling of a long-running riddle. A serial story nobody asked to read, but everyone's forced to follow. Each time a new report comes in, there's that little sigh in the station. Another unlocked window, another handful of valuables gone, and, of course, another crossword grid sitting there like a calling card. The clues themselves are never obvious. No hidden messages tucked inside, no dramatic signature like the Riddler would have left in a comic book. Just grids, sometimes only a handful of letters filled in. One house had Cain written where walking stick was the clue. Another had Mars scrawled under red planet. Simple, straightforward answers. No clever twists, no cryptograms. Almost disappointing if you were hoping for a Sherlock Holmes moment. And yet, that's what made it stranger, the ordinariness of it. It wasn't genius. It was compulsive. You picture yourself entering one of these homes, a tidy living room, the curtains still swaying faintly because someone forgot or chose not to close the window behind them. A rug with the slightest imprint where a stranger sat cross-legged, maybe eating one of the jelly candies left in a dish. On the coffee table, the crossword. Always the crossword. Sometimes a newspaper folded to that page, sometimes a magazine puzzle torn out neatly. And you realize he didn't bring these puzzles with him. He took whatever was lying around. He entered not just homes, but minds, choosing puzzles the way you might choose a snack at random. Here's a quirky fact to chew on. In psychology, there's something called the Zeigarnik effect. It describes how people remember unfinished tasks more vividly than completed ones. Leave a puzzle half done, and your brain itches for closure. Waiters in studies remembered unpaid orders with perfect clarity. But once the bill was settled, the details faded. So maybe this burglar knew, consciously or not, that leaving crosswords unfinished would make sure the victims never forgot him. That half-filled 5 across was an itch that couldn't be scratched. You lean into the mirror effect again. Think about your own desk, half-written notes, open tabs on your browser, that one hobby project gathering dust in the corner. Isn't there something haunting about the undone? Something that nags at you even in quiet hours? That's what he weaponized, perhaps without even realizing it, the low-level irritation of incompleteness. The detectives, of course, tried to chase patterns. They circled answers in red ink, wondering if orbit connected to Mars, if Cain hinted at an old man, if maybe the burglar was spelling out his biography across multiple crimes. And yet, the more they looked, the less sense it made. A puzzle lover leaves puzzles? Sure, but why never finish them? Why always the same soft pencil lead, never a pen? Why leave the room otherwise immaculate? At one house, investigators noticed something even odder. A jewelry box was left open on the dresser. The most valuable items inside, gold chains, an emerald ring, were untouched. Instead, a few small trinkets had been taken. A pewter locket shaped like a bird, A plastic keychain with faded lettering, a watch that hadn't worked in years. It looked less like theft and more like collecting. The crossword on the nightstand bore only one word: nest. Whether it was coincidence or message, no one could decide. Experts still argue whether these choices showed sentimentality or whether he just didn't know the market value of anything he grabbed. You stand in that room now, hearing the soft hum of the night through the open window, feeling the strange contradiction. A burglar who takes worthless objects but leaves puzzles, who enters without violence but leaves behind anxiety. It's almost like he was rearranging the emotional furniture of the home, not the physical. You wonder if that's more terrifying than theft itself. The townspeople, naturally, began to embellish. Some swore they'd seen him in the shadows, a man with a notebook tucked under his arm. Others said they heard faint humming when they came home, as if he'd been whistling to himself while solving. Kids whispered about the puzzle ghost, daring each other to leave their own crossword books on porches overnight, just to see if he'd stop by. And maybe he did. Maybe he found those offerings insulting, too easy, too obvious. Or maybe he ignored them because the ritual wasn't about puzzles themselves. It was about entering lives uninvited, bending the normal rules of intimacy. Here's where the reframe trickles in. Maybe this wasn't about puzzles at all. Maybe it was about time. Think about it. Burglary is usually quick. Get in, grab, get out. But what if someone wanted to stretch the moment, to prolong the liminal thrill of being inside another person's world? Sitting down with a crossword wasn't a clue. It was a way of savoring, like sipping a stranger's tea, like trying on the rhythm of someone else's evening. One detective even joked, half serious, that maybe the burglar didn't even realize he was stealing. What if, he said, he thinks he's just visiting? That statement hung in the air, ridiculous yet unsettling, because the stolen objects were rarely valuable. But the time, the comfort, the familiarity, that's what he took. He inserted himself into their lives for a few quiet minutes, and then slipped away, leaving only graphite trails. Of course, none of this helped the actual investigation. Without fingerprints or witness sightings, the police were left chasing psychology instead of evidence. They called in consultants, those calm academic types who spoke about compulsions and rituals. One explained that compulsive thieves often don't care about money. They care about the urge, the soothing loop of behavior. Breaking in, sitting down, filling in squares. It was one closed circuit of compulsion, like scratching an itch you can't not scratch. But here's the ambiguity that still lingers. Was it compulsion or performance? Was he calming his nerves with puzzles, or was he building a legend, knowing townsfolk would talk about the crossword burglar long after he was gone? Experts can't agree. And maybe that's the point. As you step back out of that imagined house, you notice the town's quiet again. The windows glow with late-night lamplight, but curtains twitch more often now, neighbors peeking out just in case. And somewhere, out there, the burglar sharpens another pencil. You wonder, not without a chill, if tonight is your night. You picture yourself walking alongside the investigators as the puzzle trail grows longer. Each house tells the same soft story. The gentle break-in, the odd missing trinket, the crossword half solved. And with every incident, the mood in town shifts. It isn't fear, not in the usual sense. It's something subtler. You can lock your windows, you can double-check your doors, but how do you keep out someone who isn't interested in smashing and grabbing, someone who lingers like a guest you never invited? That's the real crime here, the invasion of your rhythm, the rewriting of your ordinary night. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes that this burglar wasn't just stealing. He was playing. Imagine it, a person slipping into a stranger's kitchen, pocketing a trinket, then pouring themselves into a crossword puzzle like it was the main attraction. That's not a robbery. It's a game, one only he knew the rules to. The mirror effect leans in again. You remember those times you've gotten hooked on a little ritual, opening your phone for just a quick scroll, or losing track of hours in a jigsaw puzzle because the pieces seem to demand completion. You might laugh at yourself later. How did I waste so much time on that? But in the moment, it feels like a current pulling you under. Now imagine that same compulsion, but twisted into the adrenaline of a burglary. What if the crossword wasn't just a pastime for him? What if it was the whole point? The detectives, of course, debated this late into the night. You can almost see them around the scarred wooden table, coffee cups ringed with dark stains, eyes narrowed over grids spread out like maps. One officer suggests that the burglar was mocking them, leaving simple words as breadcrumbs. Another rolls his eyes. If he's taunting us, he's not very clever about it. These are just beginner puzzles. A third wonders aloud whether the crosswords are a kind of therapy, his way of grounding himself after the risky thrill of trespassing. And nobody can agree. Experts still argue about this division: game or therapy, arrogance or compulsion. A quirky fact slips into your mind here. The very first crossword published in America back in 1913 was considered a novelty so trivial that the editor thought it might ruin the paper's reputation. Instead, readers went wild, demanding more. Obsession was born instantly. Maybe our burglar was tapping into that same primal lure. Squares, grids, clues. It all feels harmless, but it grips the mind like nothing else. You imagine him, let's call him the player for now, entering a house late at night. He moves softly, maybe even politely. He picks up a puzzle book, flips through it, finds a page halfway empty. His breathing slows, his pencil moves. At that moment, it's not about theft. It's about quiet. It's about control. The house could be filled with alarms or shadows, but in those minutes, it's just him and the puzzle. But here's the reframe. Maybe the puzzles weren't a distraction. Maybe they were the burglary. What if stealing was secondary, almost accidental? Think about it. The player takes nothing of real value, just enough to justify calling it a burglary. But the true theft? Time. Normalcy. The peace of mind you once had when you left your crossword unfinished on the table, knowing no one else would touch it. That's gone now. And isn't that more unsettling than the missing trinkets? You linger in a particular living room, imagining the evidence spread across the table. A crossword with orbit, cane, and Mars filled in. A cookie dish slightly lighter. An old radio still humming faintly because he must have switched it on and then forgotten to turn it off. You tilt your head. Did he want someone to know he'd been there? Did he enjoy imagining the gasp of the homeowner finding his half-finished puzzle in the morning? The open loop of a stranger's thoughts pressed into their paper? Detectives tried chasing patterns in the clues. Orbit, Mars, cane, nest. Were these pieces of a bigger riddle? A story spelled out over time? You trace the words with your finger, and it almost feels like poetry, but poetry without punctuation. Meaning, maybe, but always just out of reach. And maybe that was the point. He wasn't giving them a trail, he was giving them an itch. The healing pause comes here. You stop, imagining the silence that fills a home after a burglary like this. No broken glass, no sirens, just the quiet and the unsettling knowledge that someone sat exactly where you sit now, filled in the word nest, and then left without a sound. You breathe into that silence, let it settle into your chest. A stranger's calm overlapping with your own. And here's another odd debate. Was he leaving the puzzles incomplete because he wanted the residents to finish them? As if the burglary wasn't an ending, but a conversation starter? Or was he always interrupted, too nervous to linger long enough to complete them? You can't know. Nobody can. Experts still argue whether the incompleteness was deliberate theater or nervous haste. Meanwhile, the town's humor darkened into legend. At the diner, people joked about checking their puzzles every morning to see if the player had stopped by. One old man swore that his crossword had been corrected. He'd written ERA when the right answer was Eon, and the burglar apparently fixed it. Whether that story's true or not, it spread. And with each telling, the player grew larger, stranger, more ghost than man. Yet, the reality remains sharp. Each clue, each grid, each word in pencil was a reminder. Someone was out there, living in the overlap between crime and play. And you, walking through this quiet town, can't shake the feeling that maybe you've already crossed his path. Maybe you've already solved a clue he left behind without even realizing it. You keep walking through the thread of this story, and it pulls you deeper, not toward the streets or the houses, but into the mind behind the pencil. It's no longer enough to note what the burglar does. You want to know why. And that means diving into the realm of psychology, the endless cabinet of theories where behaviors are taken apart like clocks and examined piece by piece. Puzzle obsession isn't rare. You've probably felt that tingle of satisfaction when a word locks perfectly into place. But when obsession tips into compulsion, it can become a cage. Psychologists describe compulsions as rituals meant to quiet inner storms. Washing hands again and again, checking the stove, arranging books into neat rows. They're not logical, they're soothing. And so you begin to see the burglar's crosswords not as pranks or even calling cards, but as rituals. Each word filled in like a bead on a rosary, each square a moment of borrowed calm. The reframe here is almost uncomfortable. Instead of picturing a cunning criminal smirking at the police, imagine a nervous mind desperate for control. The burglary wasn't about greed, it was about environment. He couldn't calm himself in his own space anymore. He needed the risk, the tension, the unfamiliar. Imagine him sitting at your table, heart hammering from breaking in, and then slowing with every penciled letter. Orbit, cane, nest. Each word like a breath, each crossword a heartbeat slowing back down. Quirky fact for you, there's actually a term called puzzle therapy. In cognitive behavioral practices, puzzles are sometimes used to help patients build focus, slow down racing thoughts, or redirect anxious energy. And yet, in this case, therapy slipped into pathology. The burglar wasn't guided by a therapist, he was guided by the itch of his own brain. As you walk this mental corridor, you begin to see more. Psychologists often link compulsive behavior with a deep need for control, especially in lives where control was denied. Childhoods filled with chaos, parents whose moods swung unpredictably, households where silence was safer than speaking. A child in that environment might retreat into patterns, grids, numbers, the certainty that 3 down has only one right answer, the safety of rules that never change. Now, imagine that child growing older. The puzzles remain, but the world presses harder, messier. The rent is due, the job interview looms, relationships demand vulnerability. And in the face of all that chaos, the puzzle grid remains perfect. Maybe burglary was never the end goal. Maybe it was the only way he could create the conditions for his ritual. Because nothing sharpens the edges of compulsion like adrenaline. Breaking in gave him the electric jolt, and puzzles gave him the release. Together, they formed a cycle. The detectives couldn't help but speculate about this too. Around that same scarred table, one suggested childhood neglect. Another mentioned obsessive-compulsive personality traits. Less about germs, more about rigidity, perfectionism, ritual. And a third leaned toward narcissism, insisting that leaving the puzzles was about being remembered. You can see the disagreement even now. Experts still argue about which diagnosis fits, or if the truth is something stranger. You stand in a quiet room again, but this time you're not looking at the crossword. You're looking at the way the burglar sat. Cross-legged, probably. Pencil tapping. Breathing slower with each square. And you feel the mirror effect tugging gently at you. Think of your own rituals. The way you line up your morning coffee mug, or the way you always check the lock twice before bed. Do those tiny acts make you feel in control? Maybe they're not so different. Of course, there's a darkness here too. Compulsions might soothe, but they also chain. If this burglar truly needed crosswords to calm his storms, then he was trapped. Every burglary wasn't freedom, it was necessity. The open loop he created wasn't just for his victims, it was for himself too. A puzzle unfinished, a ritual incomplete, so he'd have to return, again and again. Here's the healing pause. You let that sink in. Imagine living like that. Imagine needing to risk arrest just to feel steady. Needing other people's living rooms just to slow your pulse. You breathe into that image, a mix of sympathy and unease. A quirky little detail came up in one report. In one of the crossword grids, where the clue was self-portrait, he wrote, mask. Not the expected answer, not correct. But it fit the squares. The detectives argued whether this was intentional. Was he hinting at himself, hiding in plain sight? Or was it just a random slip of the pen? Again, no one can say. But that one word, mask, hung in the air like a confession half-spoken. You can't help but think about the open debate. Was this man a narcissist, enjoying the legend he was weaving? Or was he a compulsive, barely aware of the performance he created? And here's the ambiguity. Maybe he was both. Maybe compulsion and ego often share a wall, each feeding the other. You step back now, tracing how the player's rituals left ripples across the town. It wasn't just missing trinkets or smudged puzzle grids. It was the constant reminder that someone else's compulsions could rewrite your sense of safety. That your own unfinished crossword might not be yours alone anymore. And isn't that the most unsettling thought of all? That someone else's ritual could reach into your quiet life and turn it into part of their cycle? You start to see it once you stop looking for drama and start counting the small repeats. The caseboard isn't a thunderclap of red string. It's a quiet braid of habits. You trace the pins with your finger, whispering the cadence out loud like a bedtime rhyme. Window latch, soft step, trinket pocketed, kettle touched, crossword opened, pencil moving, exit. Over and over, the same gentle drumbeat. Remember that chipped teacup on the widow's counter? It wasn't a one-off. In half the reports, there's tea involved, bags left steeping until the water went the color of old varnish. Somewhere, a British grandmother felt a disturbance in the force. At the latest house, you notice the ring of a mug set down while still hot, a faint circle glossing the wood. The kettle's base is warm, but the switch is off, which means he turned the boil into ritual and then denied himself the sip. The detectives argue what that means. One says caffeine and adrenaline don't mix. Another says he wanted the scent, not the drink. You lean in. Steam is a kind of privacy curtain. It fogs mirrors, swallows shapes, slows the pulse when it rolls against the face. Maybe he hovers there for a breath, letting the room become a soft echo chamber while he finds the first across clue. You crouch at the coffee table. The grid tonight is ordinary. No Saturday brain twister, no Sunday marathon. Largest desert, EST. Walking stick, cane. There it is again, the old trio, orbit, cane, nest, turning up like recurring notes in a melody. He never finishes the grid. He never smashes the place. He never forgets to leave the window he used ajar by 2 inches, as if the night itself should be able to slip back out. You smile despite yourself. If Compulsions had a brand manager, this one's packaging would be immaculate. You also briefly consider starting a support group for neglected kettles. Here's the core concept humming underneath: the habit loop. Cue, routine, reward. The cue is entry, the click of the sash, the rise of the heartbeat, the dim hush of a stranger's living room at 9:43 p.m. The routine is the dance: trinket, kettle, grid, pencil. The reward is the quiet that settles in his chest when letters fit and the room obeys. When investigators mapped timestamps, most entries clustered between 9:15 and 10:40 p.m., weeknights more than weekends, as if he had somewhere to be the next morning. That's not a master criminal. That's a calendar person. The scariest monster might also set phone alarms for laundry. A quirky little fact drifts up while you watch the eraser dust sparkle in lamplight. Standard American crosswords often use rotational symmetry. Turn the grid 180 degrees, and the pattern of black squares mirrors itself. Makers say it feels fair to the solver's eye. You think about that while tracing his routine. Maybe he likes fairness, too, in his way. 2 inches open on the window going in, 2 inches open coming out. Tea warmed, tea denied. Words begun, words left unfinished. Balance, even in trespass. Detectives catalog the microtells. The pencil impressions suggest a soft lead, 2B, maybe HB on nights when the humidity climbs. Vinyl eraser crumbs, not needed. Tiny squares that cling to a fingertip. Shoe prints that read like low-profile sneakers, cheap rubber. A sole pattern you could buy in any drugstore. He wipes nothing aggressively, yet there are almost no usable prints. Pressure control again. It's hard not to picture a hand that has practiced this calm the way a violinist practices scales. Then there are the trophies, or souvenirs, depending on which textbook you favor. True crime detail. A trophy is kept to relive the power of the crime. A souvenir is kept to remember the person or moment. His choices: bird-shaped pewter lockets, dead watches, plastic keychains with faded names, fit neither greed nor utility. They fit remembrance. Experts still argue whether he's collecting feelings, souvenirs, or victories, trophies, and the argument never quite resolves because the objects are so stubbornly sentimental and so stubbornly worthless. Reframe it, and you get something stranger. Maybe the worthless was the point. Worthless things don't change hands on pawn counters. Worthless things are loyal. You let the mirror effect nudge you. What are your loops? The way you open the fridge for no reason. The habit of reading the same 3 headlines before bed, the nightly promise to finish a puzzle, and the equally nightly decision to leave 1 square blank, as if incompletion gives you permission to return. You catch yourself smiling. Some nights, order is the lullaby. Other nights, the lullaby is to still 1 soft task waiting for tomorrow. If that's you, How far, really, are you from the man who leaves nest and slips away? In one house, the player, yes, you still call him that, moved a chair by exactly the width of a palm. In another, he tapped the radio power and then turned the volume to a whisper so faint the homeowner thought it was a pipe hiss. In a third, he aligned a stack of envelopes by their stamp corners. Nothing dramatic, just a polite rearrangement, like tidying the world by millimeters. There's comfort in that scale. You can't fix life, but you can square a stack of bills. No promises on the bills paying themselves. The detectives, to their credit, hunt the pattern for cracks. What happens if you break his loop? Do you unplug the kettle, hide every crossword book, lock windows, and leave only doors? A consultant suggests an experiment. Remove the cue, starve the routine. But a sergeant shakes his head. The loop is portable. If there's no crossword, he'll find a placemat with a checkered pattern and pretend. If there's no kettle, he'll open the freezer and breathe the cold. Compulsions are creative. They will build a door if they can't find one. You give yourself the healing pause. You stand in the quiet room and count your breaths to 4, letting the picture soften. The open window, the T halo on wood, the pencil line pressed a little too hard at the end of the word orbit, where the hand must have heard a floorboard creak. In that pause, the player stops being a headline and becomes a person again, someone who needed the room to become a gentle place for 5 minutes. You don't excuse him, you just see him. A second quirky fact floats by, featherlight. Those gray pencil crumbs you brush away are technically eraser danders. Station techs nickname them snow. They collect in corners and betray a timeline. Fresh snow is loose, old snow is compacted by air currents. In 2 scenes, the snow was so recent that a sneeze would have moved it. He left minutes before discovery. You picture the proximity and feel your shoulders tighten, and then release, because you're in bed, listening, and the only footsteps now are memory. There's an ambiguity you can't shake, the T. Is it a courtesy, warming the house without drinking a drop? Is it a self-test? You can stop at the edge of comfort, you can leave the reward on the table? Or is it camouflage, a scent and a sound to fold the room into something domestic? Experts still argue whether the T is about soothing or staging. Your private guest floats somewhere between. He wants the room to feel like it's known him forever, so he can borrow the feeling back. The loop closes again. Window, step, trinket, kettle, grid, pencil, exit. On your way out of the scene, you glance at the answer he forced into the wrong clue weeks ago, mask, and wonder if patterns are the truest face any of us ever wear. You leave the window 2 inches open behind you, the night slipping in and out like breath, and you ask yourself one last open question as you pull the curtains together. If the loop broke one day, if the tea cooled without a ring, if the crossword went untouched, would you feel safer, or would the silence be the loudest thing you've heard all year? You walk slowly now, following the soft graphite trail, not just into homes, but into minds. Tonight, your steps feel heavier, because the question that hangs isn't about how the burglar gets in or out, it's about why puzzles. Of all the rituals to wrap his life around, why inkless words in tiny squares? You glance at one of the crosswords again, the corner smudged where his thumb must have steadied the page. The words aren't clever, not coded messages, not riddles meant to taunt. They're just there. And yet they feel loaded with meaning because of where they've been left. Crosswords, psychologists remind you, are often used as calming tools. The predictable structure, the neat grid, the numbered clues, the clear right or wrong answers, offers what life rarely does: certainty. Anxiety is softened by boundaries, and maybe that's why he needed them. In a room that wasn't his, surrounded by the uncertainty of crime, he needed the perfect certainty of red planet equals Mars. You picture him scribbling the word down, exhaling slowly as each letter fits. A storm outside, but order inside the box. Here's a quirky little fact. The human brain actually rewards itself with dopamine for pattern recognition. It's the same buzz you get from finishing a puzzle that you get from finally remembering the name of that actor halfway through a movie. So perhaps for him, burglary wasn't about valuables at all. It was about harvesting that little chemical sigh over and over until he could sleep. But then comes the reframe, sliding in like a quiet draft. What if the puzzles weren't self-soothing, but mocking? Think about it. leaving behind something so trivial that the homeowners couldn't help but notice. A crossword isn't threatening, but it's intimate. It sits on your nightstand. It keeps you company with coffee. By filling in half the grid, he was whispering, "I was here, in your routine. I touched what you touch. I know what relaxes you." That's not just compulsion. That's psychological theater. You tilt your head and let the mirror effect lean closer. How many of your own calming rituals would look strange if someone else walked in? The way you hum while brushing your teeth. The habit of circling one word 3 times in a notebook when you're stuck. To you, they're harmless. To an outsider, they might seem eerie. And suddenly, you feel the burglar's presence differently. Not as a monster, but as a mirror reflecting your own odd comforts back at you. The detectives wrestled with this duality. Some insisted that the crosswords were mockery, a breadcrumb trail of smugness. Others were convinced they were self-medication, a coping tool. And still others shrugged, saying maybe it was both, that dualities often live together. The ambiguity made the case harder, but also more fascinating. Experts still argue whether ritual behaviors in crime can serve 2 masters, ego and anxiety at the same time. You pause at one house in particular. The homeowner returned to find her crossword book on the floor, pages folded neatly, not torn. The puzzle inside had just 3 words filled nest, mask, Mars. She swore she'd never written them. And what unnerved her more than the missing earrings was that those 3 words, by sheer coincidence or design, summed up her week. She'd been tending a bird's nest in her yard, buying masks for her children's school play, and teaching them about the planet Mars for a science project. Was it coincidence? Or was he watching her life closely enough to weave it into the grid? Here's the healing pause. You sit with that thought, letting the silence of the room weigh down. Imagine walking into your own home and finding a stranger has chosen words that echo your private week. Your breath slows, the hum of the fan becomes louder, and you can't decide if it's cosmic accident or pointed message. Another quirky tidbit. During World War II, crosswords were so popular that intelligence services had to monitor them. Once, sensitive military code names accidentally appeared as answers, raising suspicions that spies were using grids to smuggle secrets. It turned out to be coincidence, but it taught governments to take puzzles seriously. And maybe that history lingers in your thoughts now. If a crossword could hide war secrets, why not a burglar's confessions? You remember the chipped teacup again. In one house, he'd left it beside the grid, as if staging the scene. Tea cooling, pencil tapping, clues filling. A domestic picture, almost cozy. And yet, what is coziness in the wrong context but unease in disguise? That's the reframe again. What should comfort you unsettles you most when a stranger is involved? The townsfolk argued about intent too. Some swore he was mocking them. Others thought he was lonely, leaving traces like a dog scratching the door. One woman said, "It feels like he wants us to know him, but only through puzzles." That line caught fire in the gossip mill, and soon the burglar wasn't just the player, he was the man who wanted to be known. And here's the open loop that pulls you closer. Was it working? Were the crosswords his confession, scattered piece by piece? Or was it all just static, empty letters to pass the time? You don't know. The detectives didn't know. And even now, years later, experts still argue. But as you step back out of the imagined house, letting the door creak softly behind you, you notice something you hadn't before. Every grid he left was incomplete, yes, but incomplete in a way that begged participation. A half-open door, a half-filled clue. Was it an invitation, a dare, or just the inevitable sign of someone who never lingered long enough to finish? You leave that question open, because maybe that's the point. Maybe the crossword burglar's greatest theft wasn't the trinkets at all. Maybe it was the certainty you once had that your puzzles were yours alone. You shuffle the case notes in your mind and sit down with the detectives, the air in the station smelling of stale coffee and tired theories. They're not laughing anymore. The novelty of the puzzle burglar has worn thin, and what's left is frustration. Like a crossword clue that looks obvious until you stare too long and the answer slips away. You watch their faces as they lean over the grids collected from crime scenes, each one plastic sleeved, each one handled with the careful reverence of fragile evidence. And yet, the grids never talk. They just sit there, mute and unfinished, daring the investigators to read meaning where maybe there is none. You imagine yourself at the table, eyes flicking from clue to clue. Largest desert, walking stick, orbit. They're not messages, not codes. They're filler words anyone could solve. And that's what gnaws at the detectives, the ordinariness. Criminals love signatures. They carve initials, they spray graffiti, they invent symbols. This burglar? He just does crosswords like a bored commuter. It's infuriating. One officer, her hair pulled back so tight it looks like it hurts, slams her pencil down. If this is a game, it's the dumbest game I've ever played. Another tries to soothe her. Maybe he's not mocking us. Maybe this is his, I don't know, meditation. You can feel the room divide again, the endless tug of war between seeing the puzzles as taunts or as therapy. Experts still argue whether repetitive behaviors in crime are communication or compulsion. And in this case, the answer seems to shift depending on which detective's coffee runs out first. Here's a quirky fact to loosen the tension. In 1944, a crossword puzzle in a British paper accidentally contained several secret code names for the D-Day operation: Utah, Omaha, Overlord. Security services panicked, thinking spies had infiltrated. Turned out, the crossword compiler just picked common words at random. Coincidence masquerading as conspiracy. And maybe that's what these detectives fear most, that they're chasing meaning in smudged pencil when all they've got is coincidence. Still, the frustration grows. You can see it in their notebooks, margins filled with theories. Is nest a reference to his home? Does mask suggest he hides in plain sight? Does cane mean he limps? The human brain is a pattern machine, desperate to fill gaps, allergic to ambiguity. The burglar knew this, whether consciously or instinctively, and he exploited it perfectly. He didn't need to taunt. He just needed to leave enough unfinished loops that the detectives would drive themselves mad completing them. You feel the mirror effect pulling on you again. Haven't you stared at something simple? An email, a text, a note, and overanalyzed it until it became something else entirely? A pause in a sentence feels like judgment. A missing word feels like hidden meaning. Maybe that's what makes this story so sticky. The burglar is playing the same game our own minds play with us every day. One night, you sitting on a stakeout, the detectives packed into a van that smells of old fries. They've chosen a row of houses where the burglar might strike next, and they wait. Hours tick by. Coffee cools. One detective fiddles with a crossword of his own, muttering under his breath. You smirk. Because what else can you do? You're waiting for a man who leaves puzzles, and your own boredom forces you into the same ritual. You even whisper a joke to yourself. If he doesn't show, maybe I'll finish his grid instead. But of course, he doesn't come. He never comes when watched. When the detectives return, bleary-eyed, they find out he struck across town. Another house, another trinket missing, another crossword page left folded on a chair. This time, the answers are wrong. Pacific Ocean, scrawled into a slot meant for 5 letters. Bird, written into a clue for tool. Was he sloppy? Tired? Or was this mockery after all? The debate reignites, voices rising like the buzz of mosquitoes around a lamp. Here's where the healing pause belongs. You step back from the noise and imagine the burglar sitting quietly in that house. The pencil in his hand trembles just slightly. He presses too hard, writes Pacific Ocean, where it doesn't fit, as if his mind is spinning too fast for the rules of the grid. You breathe slowly. Maybe this isn't about mocking or soothing. Maybe it's about fracture. The crossword no longer holds him steady, and yet ambiguity remains. Experts still argue whether mistakes in compulsive rituals reveal deterioration or design. Was he falling apart under pressure, or was he laughing in graphite? You don't know. The detectives don't know. And the town, caught in the in-between, whispers stories that grow stranger each week. Quirky tidbit: some police officers, frustrated with the case, started leaving crosswords around the station, daring each other to finish them. It became a joke, but also a coping mechanism. You watch them chuckle over the grids, trading answers like school children. Irony isn't lost on you. The burglar spread his ritual even here, infecting the very people who were chasing him. And so you leave the station tonight with an open loop of your own. Were the wrong answers mistakes? Was the absence during stakeout strategy or coincidence? Is this man a puzzle master or just a restless, lonely figure scratching grids in the dark? You glance at a half-completed crossword on the detective's desk as you walk past. One square is empty. You resist the urge to fill it in. Because maybe that's the point. Maybe leaving it blank is what makes the story linger. You drift into the past now, because the present refuses to give answers. When the grid doesn't reveal meaning, you turn the page backward, into childhood shadows. Who was he before he became the man with pencil smudges on his fingers and trinkets in his pockets? You start to imagine a boy sitting alone at a kitchen table, legs dangling from a chair too tall, tracing boxes in a newspaper while the noise of adults thundered in another room. It's not hard to see the origin. Psychology textbooks will tell you, when chaos rules outside, children retreat inward into rituals, games, private worlds. Maybe his parents argued, maybe the house was drunk with volatility, maybe he simply felt invisible. Whatever the shape of it, he found a square world where rules never changed. Across and down, black and white, safe. While other kids kicked balls or chased fireflies, he bent his head over clues, finding quiet in letters that clicked into place. You let the mirror effect touch you. Didn't you, too, have that one ritual as a child? Maybe it was Lego bricks lined up by color, or the secret notebook where you copied song lyrics by hand. Maybe it was pressing the same button on the TV remote 3 times before it felt right. You recognize the comfort of that little kingdom of order, and you realize what soothes you in youth doesn't always let go when you grow older. Sometimes it follows you, dressed in new clothes. Quirky fact: studies show that children who love puzzles often score higher in spatial reasoning and long-term problem solving. But that same fixation, left unchecked, can morph into obsession. The same brain that sees elegant order can also demand it, angrily, relentlessly. It's a coin with 2 sides: heads, genius; tails, compulsion. So you picture this boy again, older now, bringing puzzle books to school, hiding in corners at recess. Teachers call him bright but distracted. Friends are thin. Maybe he writes the names of planets into margins, sketches mazes on napkins, fills notebooks with grids no one else ever sees. The seeds of solitude sink deep, but solitude is not harmless. It can sharpen into hunger. Maybe he wanted someone to notice the way he finished every crossword in the paper. Maybe he wanted someone to say, "Good job." Maybe no one did. And so the act of filling boxes became private proof. I exist. I know the answers. I can finish what the world leaves blank. The reframe grows sharper. Burglary may not have been his rebellion against society, but his reenactment of childhood. Each break-in another kitchen table, each crossword another attempt to finish what was never acknowledged. He wasn't just stealing objects, he was stealing recognition, even if no one knew his name. The detectives argued this too, though not in such poetic terms. One profiler suggested a history of neglect. Another said obsessive-compulsive tendencies often stem from formative traumas. A third scoffed and said maybe he was just bored. But the first theory stuck in your mind. You can almost see the boy-turned-man breaking into homes not for wealth, but for the familiar posture. Seated at a table, pencil in hand, waiting for quiet. Healing pause. You linger on that image. A man in the dark, scribbling into a stranger's crossword, chasing the same calm he once chased at 10 years old. You let silence coat the thought like dust on old paper. And for a moment, the burglar doesn't feel like a villain at all. He feels like someone who never escaped the kitchen table of his childhood. Yet here comes the ambiguity. Experts still argue whether childhood rituals harden into adult crimes because of trauma or whether they simply coexist with other choices. Some say compulsion doesn't excuse intrusion. Others insist the rituals explain everything. The truth floats unsolved, like a blank square that never quite fits the letters. Another quirky tidbit: crossword champions often describe a trance state. Time vanishes, worries dissolve, and the world shrinks to black and white grids. Neuroscientists call it flow. Maybe that's what he sought in burglary. Not adrenaline, not loot, just flow. The sense that for a few minutes, the world narrowed to solvable size. But flow is fragile. It never lasts. And maybe that's why he never finished his puzzles. To finish is to break the spell. To leave them open is to guarantee return. Incomplete puzzles aren't failure, they're invitations. And so the boy becomes the man, and the man becomes the burglar. He enters not for conquest, but for sanctuary. He leaves not because he's done, but because he must, because flow always slips away. Each puzzle left unfinished is the echo of a boy who never wanted the game to end. You feel the mirror effect again, stronger now. Think of your own unfinished projects, books half read, drafts half written, puzzles abandoned on page 37. Don't they haunt you just a little? Isn't there always the whisper, "Come back, finish me"? Maybe that's why his story lingers. He weaponized incompletion. He turned the universal itch of the unfinished into a calling card. The townsfolk, of course, never talked about trauma. They told simpler stories. He must be a teacher. He must be an old man. He must be a prankster. Each guest said more about them than about him. But in the quiet of your own thoughts, you know the truth is messier. Behind every ritual lies a history. Behind every crossword left half done lies a boy who once needed it to feel safe. And so you leave this imagined past with more questions than answers. Was he shaped by neglect? Was he haunted by compulsions he couldn't shake? Or was he simply someone who liked puzzles and took the habit too far? Experts still argue. You suspect they always will. But tonight, as you walk back into the present, you glance at the latest crossword left behind. The word scrawled into the middle of the grid is simple: home. And suddenly, the case feels less like crime, more like confession. You carry the thread of childhood with you as you step into the fog of possibility. Because once a story spreads, it rarely belongs to one person anymore. The burglar's rituals started to echo outside the original town, or at least people thought they did. Other communities whispered of break-ins with similar touches: an open window, a trinket missing, a crossword page left folded under a lamp. Suddenly, the question shifts from who is he to how many are there. The detectives groan under the weight of it. Case files trickle in from neighboring towns, even distant states. Some are obvious copycats, clues filled in with Sharpie instead of pencil, crossword grids cut from magazines and planted deliberately. Others feel eerily authentic, soft graphite, half-filled words, wrong answers scribbled with believable haste. The debate starts again, louder this time. Is the original burglar expanding his territory, restless and bold? Or are admirers picking up the ritual, turning crime into folklore? Here's a quirky fact to chew on. In criminology, there's a phenomenon called the copycat effect. After media coverage of a distinctive crime, similar incidents tend to spike. Psychologists argue whether it's inspiration or coincidence. Some people crave belonging to a myth, even if it means crime. And so you wonder if the burglar's half-done puzzles spread like spores, settling into other restless minds. You imagine yourself standing in one of those maybe copycat houses. The puzzle left behind is clumsy, answers forced, handwriting uneven. It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't hum with the same ritual rhythm you've come to recognize. And yet, to the terrified homeowner, it doesn't matter. The violation feels identical. Someone sat at their table, filled in half a grid, and slipped away. Authenticity is irrelevant when the fear is real. The detectives can't help but chase patterns. Orbit turns up again in one case, though written in bold ink instead of faint pencil. Mask appears in another, scrawled so hard it tore the page. Are these deliberate echoes or just the natural recycling of common crossword clues? Experts still argue whether the recurrence of certain words proves continuity or randomness. The ambiguity keeps the case open like a wound. Here's the mirror effect nudging you again. Think about trends that spread, songs, jokes, even habits. Haven't you found yourself repeating something without knowing why? A phrase, a gesture, an internet meme. Human behavior replicates itself like wildfire, especially when tinged with mystery. And so maybe the burglar's ritual wasn't his alone anymore. Maybe once he left those half-done grids, they stopped being his and became everyone's. The reframe creeps in with a colder edge. What if the burglar wanted this? What if the puzzles weren't just rituals, but seeds, ideas meant to multiply? A single man leaving half-done grids is strange. Dozens of them, scattered across towns, is legend. If his need was recognition, then the copycats gave him immortality. But immortality is messy. The more copycats emerged, the more the original story blurred. Detectives couldn't say for sure which crimes belonged to the player and which belonged to imitators. Journalists amplified the confusion, lumping them together into one puzzle burglar narrative. And the public, as always, preferred the clean myth to the messy truth. You pause here for a healing pause, letting the weight of that ambiguity sink in. Imagine being the homeowner, hearing that your burglary might not even be the real one. Imagine feeling both relieved and insulted, relieved that perhaps a local legend didn't choose you, insulted that your violation was considered second-rate, not worthy of the myth. Your house was still entered, your crossword still marred, but history might not remember it. Quirky tidbit. In the 1980s, a rash of fake Jack the Ripper letters poured into police stations, some written in crayon, some in blood. None were authentic, but all fed the legend. The Ripper became more ghost than man, and you see the same happening here. Whether by the burglar's hand or not, the crosswords began to multiply until the player was no longer one person, but an idea. Detectives hated that. Ideas can't be arrested. You can't fingerprint folklore. You can only chase individuals, and when the trail splits into dozens of half-finished grids, you lose the original thread. It becomes noise. The mirror effect draws close again. Haven't you had moments when something you started slipped out of your hands? A phrase you coined, a story you told, a habit you shared, suddenly repeated by others until you no longer owned it. Maybe the player felt the same. Maybe he hated the copycats for ruining his ritual. Or maybe he smiled, pencil hovering over another box, knowing his little obsession had escaped into the world. Experts still argue this part endlessly. Was it one man expanding his reach, or a scattered handful of mimics? Was the myth deliberately crafted, or accidentally inflated? The ambiguity refuses to settle, and maybe that's why the story endures, because the truth is trapped in the same way as the puzzles themselves. Incomplete, half-solved, waiting for someone to finish the squares. You step back from the noise of the debate and glance at the latest evidence grid. 3 words are filled: nest, mask, home. Familiar, but the handwriting feels heavier, the spacing awkward. You tilt your head, uncertain. Was it him, or was it someone wanting to be him? And the open loop remains. Maybe that's what the burglar wanted most, not to be caught, not to be understood, but to be copied. To spread his ritual until no one could tell where he ended and the myth began. The night of the near capture feels heavier than the others. You picture the detectives slouched in unmarked cars, heaters humming against the frost, every breath puffing white against the glass. They'd studied the loops, the timings, the quiet rituals. If the player always struck between 9 and 11, then tonight should be their chance. They huddle over their coffees, their own crossword books tucked in as decoys on the dash. And yet, as you walk with them through this memory, you realize that anticipation can be as exhausting as aftermath. Hours drag. Street lamps buzz with that faint electrical whine. A dog barks 2 streets away, and every detective stiffens. Time slows into the crawl of stakeout waiting, where nothing happens and everything could. Then, at 10:22 p.m., movement. A shadow slips through the narrow gap of a window on Elm Street. No smash, no alarm, just the faint bend of a curtain. One detective whispers into the radio. Another pulls on gloves. The world sharpens like glass. You follow them silently as they approach the house, each step careful. Inside, the player moves with the same rhythm as always. A trinket lifted from the mantel. The kettle clicked on, steam starting to hum. He sits at the table, pencil ready. You hold your breath as he begins to write. Slow, deliberate strokes. Mars. Mask. The familiar ritual. He doesn't know that outside, the net is drawing closer. And then the slip. One detective steps too hard on frozen grass, a crack echoing louder than a gunshot in the still night. The burglar's head jerks, the pencil halts. For a beat, you see him hesitate, the word half finished. Then he bolts. You follow the chase through the yard, the crunch of boots on frost, the slap of shoes on pavement. The player moves fast, but not desperate. There's a precision to his flight, as if he's rehearsed the exit in his mind 100 times. He darts through alleys, ducks beneath fences, disappears into the dark. By the time the detectives catch their breath, he's gone. All that remains in the house is the crossword, the kettle still warm, and on the table, eraser shavings scattered like snow. The detectives argue later, voices sharp with anger. One insists they were seconds from grabbing him. Another mutters that maybe he wanted to be seen, just enough to prove he was real, before vanishing again. Experts still argue whether criminals like the player deliberately engineer near captures to build legend, or if chance alone creates myth. Here's a quirky fact. In some cases, burglars are known to linger within sight of their pursuers, hiding close enough to hear the search parties. It's not recklessness, it's thrill. Proximity fuels the ritual. You wonder if the player crouched somewhere that night, pencil in pocket, heart pounding, listening to the detectives curse his escape. The mirror effect comes to rest on you. Haven't you ever done something reckless just to feel alive? Sneaking into a place you shouldn't, taking a risk that wasn't worth it, telling yourself you'd stop, but doing it anyway because the rush was its own reward? That's the edge the player walked nightly, the tightrope between ritual and capture. Later, the detectives pore over the crossword he left behind. This one feels different. The words are sharper, pressed harder into the page. Mars digs grooves so deep you can feel them with your fingertips. Mask, again, written heavier. And then half-scribbled the start of a longer word, eras, before the pencil halted. Was it erase? Was he leaving them a message? Or was it just another unfinished fragment? Ambiguity thickens the room. Healing pause. You sit with the image of that unfinished word, letters frozen mid-breath. The silence hums around it. What if that fragment was the closest he came to telling the truth? What if, in that second before he heard the crack of a boot on frozen grass, he was about to write his confession? You let the thought linger, soft and uncertain. Another quirky tidbit. Erasers don't actually erase. They smear graphite into tiny particles you can't see. What's left behind isn't absence. It's just rearrangement. The word erase, had he finished it, would have been the perfect metaphor. Not gone, just altered. Like his presence in every home. Never vanished, just rearranged into silence. The detectives replay the chase for weeks. One swears he saw the player's jacket catch the lamplight. Dark, nondescript, nothing to identify. Another remembers the way his stride looked almost practiced. Like a runner, he says, or a man who's been chased before. They argue whether he was young or old, strong or wiry. The descriptions conflict, dissolving into the same uncertainty as the crosswords themselves. And here's the reframe you can't ignore. Maybe the near capture wasn't failure. Maybe it was the truest expression of his ritual yet. Not just sitting at a table, not just leaving a puzzle, but orchestrating the ultimate unfinished clue, himself. To let them almost catch him, to let the story almost resolve, to stop just short like a crossword left incomplete. The townsfolk hear the story quickly, gossip weaving through diners and sidewalks. Some cheer that the police almost had him. Others shake their heads. Almost doesn't count. Children whisper that the puzzle ghost outran the law because he knew shortcuts only crosswords could reveal. And the legend grows another branch, wider and wilder. You step back into the house one last time. The kettle is still warm to the touch. The crossword still waits, eras, dangling open. You run your finger over the grooves, imagining his hand pressing down harder than usual, almost desperate. And you wonder, was he about to confess, or was he simply lost in the grid? You'll never know. Experts still argue. The silence doesn't answer. And as you walk out into the night, you leave the window open 2 inches behind you, just as he did. Somewhere in the darkness, a pencil rolls in a pocket. Somewhere, a man breathes easier because he left you another unsolved clue. You settle into another late-night quiet, your thoughts circling the half-finished grids as though they are diaries written in code. The idea has been floating in your head since you saw that one word, mask, jammed into the wrong clue. What if these puzzles aren't signatures or taunts? What if they're confessions, little fragments of a life scattered in strangers' living rooms? You let yourself imagine the player sitting in the hush of a borrowed kitchen, his hands trembling just a little, pencil scratching faintly across paper. Not performing, not mocking, but confessing, because he can't say it out loud. Each word a shard of something he doesn't have the courage to tell directly. Nest, maybe about the home he lost. Mask, maybe about the face he wears in daylight. Home, perhaps about the longing he never shakes. You picture him pausing mid-clue, staring at the page, and realizing the puzzle has become a mirror. Here's the quirky fact that fuels your thought. Some linguists believe crosswords serve as a kind of projection test, like ink blots. Solvers unconsciously gravitate toward words that resonate emotionally. If that's true, then maybe the player wasn't choosing the words at random. Maybe his subconscious was spilling out across grids he didn't even own. The detectives, of course, scoffed at this theory. "We're not therapists," one grumbled. "We're cops. Words don't matter. Evidence matters." But others couldn't let it go. They circled the words on the grids. Orbit, cane, nest, mask, home. Together, they looked less like random answers and more like chapters of a strange memoir. Experts still argue whether the burglar was speaking in fragments or whether we just can't resist making poems out of chaos. The reframe presses gently. Perhaps this was his only form of communication. People write letters, keep journals, whisper confessions to strangers on trains. He left pencil marks in puzzle books, the closest thing to a diary he dared. Burglary gave him the space to do it without witnesses, without expectation. Imagine the relief of writing in silence, knowing no one would interrupt. The mirror effect creeps in. Think about your own ways of confessing. Maybe you scrawl lyrics in a notebook or type half-truths into a phone memo you never send. Maybe you leave drafts unsent in your email, words that feel safer in limbo than out loud. Haven't you, too, turned private corners into confessionals? You feel a flicker of kinship you don't want to admit. Healing pause. You set the thought down gently, like an eraser settling on paper. You breathe, slow, deep. The idea that the burglar wasn't mocking or performing, but simply aching in crossword squares, sits heavy in your chest. You allow the silence to cradle it, to let it sting softly without rushing past. Quirky tidbit. During therapy sessions in the 1970s, some psychologists asked patients to bring their puzzle books, not for entertainment, but because the mistakes and choices revealed patterns of stress. One woman always left long words unfinished, as if commitment itself terrified her. Another always solved clues related to family first, skipping geography and history. The theory was simple. Your puzzle choices reveal your fears. You wonder what the player's choices reveal. You picture him again, crouched at a stranger's table, filling in Mars too deeply, pressing until the pencil nearly tore through. Was he angry? Lonely? Or just distracted by the sound of a house settling around him? The ambiguity refuses to resolve. Experts still argue whether these fragments can truly be read as autobiography or if they're just the ghost of graphite. The townsfolk, of course, spun the theory into folklore. One whispered that he must be leaving love notes to someone, scattered across homes, waiting for her to piece them together. Another said the crosswords were a map, each word pointing to something buried. Stories layered themselves like pencil smudges, truth fading under myth. And yet, you can't shake the image of confession. You imagine flipping through all the grids collected in evidence and rearranging the words. Mask, nest, Mars, home, orbit. Doesn't it almost sound like a story of someone circling, hiding, longing for shelter? Doesn't it feel like a voice straining to be heard? The reframe cuts deeper. Maybe burglary wasn't the crime. Maybe burglary was the therapy session he couldn't afford, the private space he couldn't create anywhere else. To sit in someone else's quiet house, fill in words that resonated, and leave them behind like diary entries he was too afraid to keep. A stolen hour of honesty. A stolen chance to be vulnerable. You don't excuse him. You don't forgive the intrusion. But you let yourself see him not as puzzle master or trickster, but as man scribbling pieces of himself across town, hoping someone would understand. The detectives, for their part, hated this line of thought. They wanted fingerprints, not poetry. But one late at night whispered, "What if he's asking us to finish his sentences?" The idea lingered. What if the crosswords weren't clues, weren't taunts, weren't accidents, but open doors, invitations to finish what he couldn't? You leave that thought hanging, just as he left his puzzles. Because maybe the truest confession isn't complete sentences. Maybe it's fragments that ache precisely because they're unfinished. And so you step out of the imagined kitchen, the crossword still lying on the table. You resist the urge to finish the clue. You leave it open, just as he did, because you realize now, the unsolved is the confession. You walk through the town now, not with detectives, but with neighbors, with shopkeepers, with children whispering under blankets. The burglar's legend has seeped into their evenings the way steam curls from kettles. Quiet, ordinary, but impossible to ignore. What started as fear has settled into something stranger. A mix of amusement, irritation, and a kind of ghost story reverence. At the diner, the cook flips pancakes and tells newcomers, "Don't leave your puzzle books out unless you want help with 7 across." Laughter ripples through the booths, though the eyes that follow still flick toward the door when it creaks. Humor is their shield, their way of shrinking the burglar down to a bedtime anecdote instead of a midnight threat. Children invent games. One dares another to leave a crossword on the porch overnight, as though it's an offering to a spirit. In the morning, when the wind has flipped the page or the rain has blurred the ink, they squeal that the puzzle ghost answered. They swap tales of the burglar slipping through walls, of him carrying a bag filled not with gold but with sharpened pencils that never break. The myth grows with each telling, softened by play but sharpened by uncertainty. You pause at a grocery store where two neighbors lean close and gossip. He's probably a lonely widower, one says. He just wants company. The other shakes her head. No, he's a genius, testing us. One day, we'll find the big crossword and it'll solve everything. Their voices dip into excitement, not fear. The burglar has become a riddle they get to solve, a story they get to own. Here's a quirky fact. Folklore scholars note that communities often turn crimes into legends, reshaping fear into stories that can be shared. From Spring-Heeled Jack in Victorian London to phantom hitchhikers in American towns, the eerie becomes myth because myth is easier to live with than uncertainty. And so this little town bends the crossword burglar into its own folklore figure, half menace, half mascot. But the reframe whispers in your ear, isn't this exactly what he might have wanted? To be remembered not just as a thief, but as a tale told at diner counters and playgrounds. To live in stories rather than court records. Narcissist or compulsive, he succeeded. His grids outlived his footsteps. The mirror effect catches you off guard. Think of the stories your own community tells. The local ghost, the unexplained lights, the neighbor with a strange habit. Haven't you too joined in the retelling, not caring whether it's fact or fiction? That's how myths grow, through repetition, through shared glances over coffee cups. The burglar is no longer just himself. He is the town's reflection of its own need for mystery. At a town meeting, an elderly woman stands up. I don't mind him, she says softly. He never hurt anyone. He just sits and writes. It's almost sweet. Murmurs of agreement ripple. Others bristle, angry that their safety is treated so lightly. The burglar divides them, but in dividing, he also connects them. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a story. In some odd way, he's bound the town together more tightly than any parade or festival could. Healing pause. You stop, breathing in the quiet of these voices. You realize how crime transforms not only victims, but entire communities. The crossword burglar didn't just rearrange puzzle books, he rearranged the town's sense of itself. You let that settle in, like the hush that follows a campfire story, the pause before sleep when the mind lingers on shadows. Quirky tidbit. In some cultures, unfinished tasks left behind by the dead are considered spiritual fingerprints, signs of a restless soul. People rush to complete the tasks, to settle the spirit. Here, the unfinished crosswords feel the same. Some residents can't resist finishing them, as though completing the squares will soothe the burglar's ghostly presence. Others refuse, leaving the puzzles untouched, as if completion might invite him back. The detectives grow annoyed by this folklore turn. They want evidence, not campfire tales. But the more they chase him, the more the town spins his legend. One officer mutters, "He's not a ghost, he's a man." But by now it doesn't matter. To the town, he's both. The reframe slides in once more. Maybe the burglar became bigger than his own story. Maybe, once the town mythologized him, he ceased to be in control. His ritual, his compulsion, his confessions, all absorbed into a legend that belonged to everyone. Perhaps that's the greatest theft he pulled off. Stealing himself, transforming into a story. You leave the diner, the gossip, the playground games, and walk down a quiet street. Curtains glow warm behind frosty glass. You imagine each house whispering its own version of the tale. In one, laughter. Maybe he'll finish Grandma's Sudoku tonight. In another, fear. Keep the windows locked, children. In another, weary resignation. If he takes my crossword, let him. And as you walk, you feel the town's mood pressing on you. Half amusement, half unease, all wrapped in the strange intimacy of a shared legend. The burglar may never be caught, but in the stories told, in the laughter and whispers, he is already everywhere. You feel the trail thinning now, like footsteps fading into soft earth. The burglar's visits become less frequent, his ritual less predictable. Weeks pass without a single crossword discovered, and the town hovers in that peculiar space between relief and disappointment. For months, they've lived in the tension of expecting him, of wondering whose window he would slip through next. Now, with nothing happening, the silence itself feels suspicious. Detectives mark their calendars in red, waiting for the familiar window of time, 9:15 to 10:40 p.m. But the squares remain empty. They double patrols, but nothing stirs. The kettle stays cold. The puzzle books remain untouched on nightstands. It's as if he evaporated. You walk the streets at night, glancing at curtains glowing with lamplight, and the quiet feels heavier than when he was there. A quirky fact surfaces. Criminologists often note that ritualistic offenders eventually burn out, either caught or consumed by their own compulsions. The cycle demands repetition, but the repetition dulls over time, leading to either escalation or disappearance. With the crossword burglar, neither happens. He doesn't grow violent. He doesn't vanish in handcuffs. He just dwindles. So the story closes not with capture, not with clarity, but with lingering questions. Was he narcissist, compulsive, or simply lonely? Did he confess in grids or just play? Did he vanish by choice or by chance? Experts still argue. The townsfolk still wonder. You too still lean forward, pencil in hand, staring at the blank square, waiting for a letter that will never come. And that is the point. The puzzle-loving burglar remains unsolved, just like us. Now the lights grow dimmer, the story softer. You've walked through streets littered with puzzles, followed detectives through stakeouts, listened to experts argue, and peeked into the burglar's imagined childhood. And yet what you're left with isn't answers. It's the quiet hum of mystery. You breathe slower now. Let the rhythm of your chest match the gentle pacing of these words. The burglar is gone, faded into silence, but his open loops remain, like unfinished dreams waiting at the edge of memory. Each crossword he left was incomplete, and maybe that was his gift. A reminder that not everything must be solved, not every square must be filled. As you close your eyes, imagine the quiet of a small kitchen. A kettle sits on the counter, the steam long since gone. A crossword lies open on the table, a pencil resting diagonally across the page. The window is open 2 inches, the night air cool and steady. Nothing stirs, nothing intrudes. The page waits, but you don't need to finish it. You can let the blank squares be blank. That's the comfort now. Permission to leave things unresolved, to rest without chasing every answer. To understand that mysteries can be companions too, gentle presences that remind us to breathe, to wonder, to sleep. So sink deeper into your pillow. Let your breath slow. The burglar, the puzzles, the questions, they're all drifting now, fading into the soft dark where nothing needs solving. All that remains is calm, and the warmth of knowing you can let the story rest, even unfinished. The story has folded itself into silence now. The burglar, the pencil crumbs, the unfinished words, everything softens into the kind of quiet that invites sleep. You don't need to chase the ending anymore. You don't need to solve every square. Tonight, the unsolved is your companion, reminding you that it's okay to rest with mystery still in the air. Breathe slowly. Feel how your body grows heavier with each exhale, how the questions you carried a few minutes ago dissolve into something lighter. Imagine the table again, a crossword left half done, the pencil resting gently across the page, the kettle cooled. The window is open just enough to let a soft breeze slip through. Nothing demands your attention now. You are safe to let go. If this story brought you a small sense of peace, a little pocket of calm at the end of the day, hey nandang ki, de moi dem ta lai kung book tip. And if you'd like to wander through more strange, quiet tales, you can always find them in the playlist Bedtime Criminal Psychology right here on the channel, waiting like a book left open on the nightstand. But most of all, I'd love to hear from you. If you've ever lost something small, a trinket, a shoe, or even just a little piece of yourself you didn't realize you'd left behind, hey Toinge. I read every comment before I sleep, and your words weave into this circle of quiet we share. So close your eyes now. Let the unfinished puzzle rest. Let the soft dark take over. And know that even unanswered questions can carry you gently into dreams. The reframe whispers, maybe the silence is the ritual's final stage. Just as he always left puzzles unfinished, perhaps he left his own story incomplete. By fading instead of ending, he preserved the open loop forever. To disappear without capture is to remain a riddle. The townsfolk notice. At first, they relax. Windows open again at night, crossword books left casually on tables. But soon the absence itself becomes eerie. Parents hush children's questions. Neighbors whisper, why did he stop? Was he sick, dead, reformed? Did he simply tire of his own myth? Experts still argue whether criminal silence means growth, death, or reinvention. The mirror effect catches you here. Think of your own unfinished habits, the hobbies you abandoned without warning, the rituals you dropped quietly. Didn't they leave behind a ghost of themselves? Every time you see the guitar you no longer play, or the notebook with empty pages, don't you feel the ache of what used to be? That's what the town feels now, haunted not by presence, but by absence. Detectives grow restless. They flip through old case files hoping for a spark, but nothing connects. No arrests, no suspects, no hints. The burglar leaves no finale, no grand reveal. The last crossword is as ordinary as the first, half-completed, pencil smudged, eraser crumbs scattered. It ends not with a bang, but with ellipses. Here's a healing pause. You sit with that ellipsis, 3 dots trailing into silence. It feels unsatisfying, yes, but also deeply human. Not every ritual ends with closure. Some just drift, like fog dissolving at dawn. You breathe in, letting the quiet fill you, understanding that unfinished stories are sometimes the most enduring. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. In Japanese aesthetics, there's a concept called ma, the pause or negative space that gives meaning to what surrounds it. Silence between notes makes music. Blank squares in a crossword make the words matter. Maybe the burglar's disappearance was his final act of ma, a pause so large it became the shape of his story. The reframe sharpens. Perhaps he never intended to vanish. Perhaps he simply followed his ritual until the itch subsided. When the compulsion loosened its grip, there was nothing left to steal, nothing left to solve. He walked away because the puzzle no longer called him. And yet, in walking away, he became larger. A man with a name can be caught. A myth with no ending can't. The townsfolk wrestle with this void in different ways. Some insist he's still out there, waiting for the right night to return. Others claim the silence proves he was caught quietly, his story buried in paperwork. Children grow bored of the legend, turning to new games. But in quiet kitchens, when crosswords are left half done, the itch lingers. The thought that maybe, just maybe, he'll come back to finish them. Experts still argue, of course. Some believe his dwindling was intentional, an attempt to erase his trail. Others see it as natural burnout, compulsion starved of energy. And a few suggest the boldest idea of all, that the burglar was never one man, but many. And when the copycats lost interest, the story thinned on its own. The mirror effect draws close again. Haven't you noticed how your own obsessions fade? The show you binge until the night it bores you. The notebook you fill until one day you forget to open it. Obsessions rarely end with ceremony. They fade unfinished, and in their fading, they leave behind nostalgia sharper than satisfaction. You stand now at the window of an empty house, untouched for months. Dust coats the sill. No pencil marks stain the table. The crossword book lies clean, its pages unbent. The burglar hasn't returned. The silence hums louder than his presence ever did. And that's the paradox you leave with tonight. The player's fading trail doesn't close the case. It opens it wider. The absence becomes its own riddle, its own half-filled crossword. And maybe that was the truest ritual of all, never giving an ending, leaving everyone forever leaning forward, pencil in hand, waiting for the next square to be filled. The story circles back to you now, not in the clatter of detectives or the whispers of neighbors, but in the quiet reflection that lingers after the trail has gone cold. You walk through the town with no new reports, no fresh puzzles, only the faint memory of graphite lines that once unsettled kitchens and bedrooms. What remains is not evidence, but questions, unanswered, unfinished, like the very grids he left behind. You stop at the diner where his legend was once traded like currency. The cook no longer makes crossword jokes. The children no longer dare each other to leave puzzle books on porches. Life has shifted back toward normal, but it's a normal with a bruise. Conversations dip into silence when the burglar's name comes up. People shrug, laugh it off, change the subject. Yet behind their eyes, the questions still hum. Who was he? Why did he do it? Why here? Why us? Experts still argue. They gather at conferences, presenting papers with confident titles, but hesitant conclusions. Some insist he was a narcissist, planting puzzles to be remembered forever. Others argue compulsion, that he was soothing storms in his own mind, never caring whether anyone noticed. A few dismiss it as quirk, insisting that the story grew larger only because we fed it with attention. And none of them agree. Each theory fits a corner, but the full grid never completes. The mirror effect catches you in its net. Haven't you too built puzzles out of your own life? Trying to explain patterns and choices, searching for meaning in mistakes? Maybe that's why his story grips so tightly. It isn't just about him, it's about us, the way we can't bear blanks, the way we demand answers even when none exist. Quirky fact, there's a psychological principle called closure need. Humans are wired to prefer a wrong answer over no answer at all. The crossword burglar weaponized that instinct without lifting a finger. By leaving every puzzle unfinished, he ensured we would keep scratching at the paper, desperate to complete what he left behind. You think of the chipped teacup again, the faint pencil line pressed too hard on the word orbit, the eraser crumbs sparkling like dust in lamplight. Small details, yet they loom larger than the stolen trinkets. The burglar is gone, but his residue remains. Echoes of intimacy, moments when someone else's thoughts overlapped with your own. The reframe settles in. Perhaps the true crime wasn't burglary at all. Perhaps it was psychological theft, the stealing of certainty. He didn't take objects, he took peace of mind. He made people second-guess their safety, their routines, their very puzzles. And maybe that's why he lingers even now. Objects can be replaced. Certainty cannot. Healing pause. You breathe slowly, let the silence expand. Imagine the town tonight. Curtains drawn, lamps glowing, crossword books on bedside tables. Some residents still glance at their puzzles before bed, half expecting to see a stranger's handwriting across the page. Others avoid puzzles altogether, as though refusing to play his game. The absence hums, louder than presence ever did. Another quirky tidbit, crossword historians say the very first puzzle ever printed in 1913 was titled Fun's Word Cross Puzzle. Its answers were simple: cat, dog, sun. But when rediscovered years later, solvers described it as oddly haunting. To fill in words across a century is to touch another person's thoughts frozen in time. And that, perhaps, is why the burglar's crosswords sting so deeply. They are intrusions not of body, but of mind, as though you've touched a stranger's thoughts unwillingly. The town moves on, yes, but with an asterisk. The burglar becomes a ghost story told on porches, a cautionary tale for children, a bedtime riddle for insomniacs. His legend lives longer than his footsteps, and now you stand in that space between myth and memory, staring at the last crossword he left. The words are faint, smudged, almost gone. Mask, home, nest. Each a fragment, each a confession, each an unfinished loop. You trace the letters with your fingertip, then set the page down. You realize with a soft ache that the mystery will never resolve, and maybe that's why it matters. The mirror effect comes one last time. You see yourself in him, not in his crimes, but in his incompletions. Haven't you left sentences unfinished, projects half done, promises trailing like ellipses? Maybe we all carry half-filled crosswords in our lives. His just happened to spill into ours.